Okay, thank you very much for the kind introduction. So at the end of the talk, there's usually the part where, you know, if you like what I say, you'll applaud, and then I'll say thank you, but you won't hear that I'm saying thank you because you're applauding. So I'm going to reverse the order, and I'm going to start by saying thank you. I'm going to thank you for being here, because if you're here, if you're spending your evenings doing things like this, if you're taking part in Indivisible, if you're thinking about the relationship between Christianity and activism, you're already doing the kinds of things that the book asks you to do. So I'm going to begin by thanking you. I'm going to begin by applauding you. Thank you very much for being here. And what I'm now going to do, yeah, see, it's awkward, right? Because you think, should I applaud myself now? Am I that good? Should I applaud my neighbor, right? Okay. What I'd like to do is share with you just 3 thoughts in the next 20 or 30 minutes, and then we can talk back and forth. The 3 thoughts have to do with where I'm coming from in writing this book. The introduction was kind enough to mention what work I usually do. Where have we got ourselves to since I wrote the book? Because remember, if the book exists, that means I didn't write it today. I wrote it actually 6 months ago. So if it seems to resemble our present circumstances, that would seem to suggest that history is worthwhile as a guide to our present moment. In other words, the existence and the popularity of the book is in some sense a confirmation of its very thesis. And then I will ask, historically, who has been concerned about tyranny in the United States, and then say a couple of words about how history can help. So where am I coming from? I'm a historian. History is what I do. I didn't expect to be doing the kinds of things that I'm doing now. I've spent the last 25 years learning East European languages, learning to read Russian and German and Yiddish and Polish, the languages that allow me to be a historian of some of the darker chapters of East European history. What that means is that I have a sense that all of that is real. When I look upon the United States of America, I think, yes, that's real too, but always in the back of my mind is this broader range of possibility, the things that we can do or the things that we will watch happening in just slightly different circumstances. If you turn the knob just a tiny bit, it's not so difficult to see us in Czechoslovakia in 1948 as communism arises, or us in Germany in 1933. Those people were not so very different, which is another part of where I'm coming from. To become a historian of these events, I had to know people who lived through them. I had the great privilege, still have the great privilege, of being the friend and the student of East Europeans, Central Europeans who lived through communism, or who also lived through National Socialism or fascism. And not only have I learned from these people, and not only do their names figure in the book, scattered throughout the book, from the epigraph all the way through, this is another part of where I'm coming from, because if I can learn from these people, and if we can have a conversation which is based upon their experiences and ideas, that means not only can it happen, it happens to people like us. If they can communicate with me and I can communicate with you, these are people like us. The third place that I'm coming from has to do with my teaching. I'm not as old as I look, and I'm not as old as you think I am. But so they were like, whenever I do that, they're like nice women in the crowd who sort of turn their head like this and smile, and I feel good. Anyway, thank you. I'm acknowledging all of you in particular and generally. It was like there were several dozen in this crowd. Thank you, but I'm trying to make a point, and the point is that I've now been teaching students for quite a long time, and because I work on East European history, my students come from Eastern Europe. And if you think about the generation of people in Eastern Europe who were born in the late 80s or the 90s, people in their 20s and 30s now, has the promise of democracy been fulfilled for them? Very often, no. In the case of Russia, in the case of Ukraine, even now Hungary, Poland, democracy is something which has receded from them throughout their lives. And in their young lives, they've had to relearn many of the lessons which my teachers had to learn in the concentration camps or in the internment camps. And many of my students now, people a generation younger than me, have had to learn how to protest, how to march. Many of them have taken the kinds of risks which we begin to contemplate now in this country. Many of them have been arrested, interned, tortured, beaten, in some cases, sadly, have been killed. And it is from them also that I'm learning. This is a place from which I'm coming when I come to the United States. So I'm trying to apply what I think I've learned from history, that it can happen, what I've learned from my teachers, that happens to people like us, that I've learned from my students, that it's happening now. What's happening in the United States is not exceptional. It's part of a global trend. Many of the things which happen here in 2016 or 2017 have already happened in other places. This is why the year 2016 was so difficult for me personally, because I watched events which had already transpired in Russia 10 years before, or in Ukraine 2 years before, transpire here, and I watched our helplessness, our inability to recognize them, which leads me to the second question. Where have we gotten ourselves to? Where are we now as a nation? I'm just going to specify here one line of development, and that is the Russia story. I do this from a slightly different perspective. The Russia story, that is the fact that Russia intervened in our elections, influenced the outcome, and that the Russian elites have their preferred candidate in the White House. This is a story that I began to follow from the Russian sources well over a year ago. I was the first person, I think, to write about this in April of 2016, when it was very clear if one was living mentally in Russia, as I do, though it's dangerous, I do it so you don't have to. If you're doing that, it was very clear well over a year ago that the Russian media and political elite had lined up behind Mr. Trump. And so I could ask in an article written way back then, why is that? Where will that take us? What does that mean? In the summer of last year, I wrote another article about how the dominant political philosophy in the Kremlin sees democracy precisely as a weakness to be exploited, as a membrane to be penetrated, as an opportunity for foreign policy. That is their general practice. It has been for some time. I was trying to get Americans to see that what was happening to us was part of a pattern, that we shouldn't be surprised, that we have to react faster than we were reacting then. When I went to Ohio in the fall, which is it's like a weakness of mine. I constantly go to Ohio. It's where I'm from, and it's intellectually really important to me, and politically also really important, morally very important to circulate a little bit like that. But when I went to Ohio to talk about the Russia story, I realized something very important, which was that nobody cared. Nobody cared. Nobody cared. Something which was very important in my own little world. My own little world, which stretches from Moscow to New Haven, something which was very important in that world had no resonance whatsoever in Ohio, and that struck me. Where are we now? So there were things that we knew about Russia before the election, which I'm just going to repeat in case you've forgotten any of them. We knew that Mr. Trump cited Russian propaganda, which was untrue at his rallies. We knew that his first foreign policy speech was written by someone on the payroll of a Russian gas company. We knew that his advisor for Russian matters was on the payroll of a Russian gas company. We knew that his campaign manager, Paul Manafort, his last job had been working for a Ukrainian kleptocrat who was driven from office after during a revolution which was caused, in effect, by his kleptocracy and authoritarianism. We knew all of that. We knew that his closest advisor on national security matters, Michael Flynn, had been paid by a Russian propaganda agency. We knew all of that before November. Now we know that we have a minister of commerce who had worked for the Bank of Cyprus, which is, if not one of the major places where Russian kleptocrats launder their money. We now have a Secretary of State who has the Order of Friendship from Mr. Putin. We have an Attorney General, the highest law officer in the land, who perjured himself in his own confirmation hearings precisely on the question of his contacts with Russia, who then recused himself from Russian matters, but understood recusing himself as firing the person who is carrying out the investigation of Russia. We have Mr. Kushner, who also lied by omission in applying for security clearance about precisely his contacts with Russia. Those contacts with Russia turn out not to be incidental, since they were about establishing a secret channel of communication, which the Russians could follow and record, but which American institutions could not. And we have, of course, the firing of Mr. Comey, which I realize these things pile on, and we don't necessarily remember them or see the significance. But when Mr. Trump fires Mr. Comey, he's saying, I'm guilty, right? When you fire the person who is investigating you, you are saying, I confess, right? I mean, the words I confess cannot physically pass through Mr. Trump's lips because a confession involves taking responsibility for something. And Mr. Trump is very unpredictable. You know, one hesitates to predict what Mr. Trump would do, but I will predict with 100% certainty that he will never take responsibility for anything of significance. So he will never say, I confess. But when you fire the person who is investigating you, you are confessing, right? That is a confession. And when the next day you speak to no one else but the Russian foreign minister about it, and the Russian ambassador, and you slap them on the back, and you smile, and you explain that the FBI director is a nutcase, a nut job. Why does Mr. Trump think that? Because Mr. Comey, whatever his flaws, is a man who believes that there are rules and laws in the world. Mr. Trump is a nihilist, internationalist kleptocrat who does not believe there are laws and rules in the world, and therefore for him, Mr. Comey is precisely a nut job. And Mr. Trump is comfortable with those Russian interlocutors because they see the world in the same way. And whatever the details of the Russian story turn out to be, and they will be much, much worse than you imagine now, whatever they turn out to be, the fundamental thing to be concerned about and to understand is that Mr. Trump sees lawless Russian kleptocracy as normal, and he sees the rule of law as something which is essentially crazy. Now, where does this bring us to? I think all of this poses a little bit of a challenge to our idea of American exceptionalism, right? I think our notion that things like this can't happen here has probably, if it hasn't started to crumble, maybe it should begin to crumble. Let me go at this in a slightly different way. There has been an upside to all of this for me, not just Trump winning, but the campaign in 2016. And the upside is I've been traveling to Europe for a very long time. And for a long time, it would be difficult to say, are people listening to me because of me? Or are they listening to me because they think that because I'm from America, I exemplify something? That's now cleared itself up completely. Right? Because no one in the world now looks at us as an exemplary democracy. No one. And I mean, okay, that was meant to be an upside, right? But it's true. I mean, the upside is that I now feel like I can take part in the natural, uninhibited conversation with Ukrainians and Russians and Hungarians and Poles and other people from whom I learn, without there being any pretenses on one side or the other. And frankly, we've lost the right to that, right? We've lost the right to be lecturing anyone else. But so my point is the American exceptionalism. If we're still thinking it can't happen here, that's not a thought anymore. If we're still thinking the institutions are going to protect us, that's not a thought. That's a reflex. It's lazy. If you think, if you're thinking those things, which I know you're not because you're here, but if you're thinking those things, you're actually making it happen here. If you say it can't happen here, you're making it happen here. Which leads me to the third point, which is who was worried about tyranny in the USA? The framers of the Constitution were, as we would say, obsessively worried about tyranny in the United States. They talked about tyranny all the time. They understood, and I think they were correct, that human nature is such that for various reasons, we will tend towards tyranny. We're vulnerable to demagogy in conditions of extreme inequality, as Aristotle knew, and as they repeated after Aristotle, democratic societies tend to collapse upon themselves. So what the founders were skeptical about human nature, and as they corresponded with one another, as they wrote the Constitution, they were trying to set up institutions which would make a collapse into tyranny less likely. What I've tried to do in the book is to follow their example. I mean, starting with a very old-fashioned title on tyranny. Tyranny is a Greek word, right? It's an ancient Greek word which they used. And by the way, there are a lot of really useful words from ancient and modern Greek which the founders knew, like, for example, oligarchy. Oligarchy is a very useful word, right? Rule by the few, rule by the rich few. Like so many things we now say, like fake news, it has come back into English by way of Russian. The term fake news actually comes from Russian. It's that word fake actually exists in Russian years before it exists here. Oligarchy as well comes back to us through Russian. Kleptocracy, that's a very good Greek word to be remembering. Rule by thieves. Nepotism, I admit, is not a Greek word, it's Italian. Nepotism, though, is another really good ancient word to have in mind. It comes in handy. But my basic point here is what I'm trying to do in the book, in this little book, is apply a method which the founders applied, and that is to look at the history you know, skeptical about human nature in general, and try to understand how democracies and republics fail. And then to apply what you can from the wisdom of people who experienced that failure. So the advantage we have over the framers is not that we're better educated, we're not, or that we're wiser, we're not. The advantage is that we have a couple hundred years more history to think through. And so what I do in the book is I draw from the history that I think I know, the history of fascism and communism. I draw from those teachers from whom I have learned, and in several places as well. For example, the chapter about corporeal politics, about the importance of getting your body out of the house, away from the screen, out into public life, here on the streets marching. That I borrow from young people. That very term, corporeal politics, comes from a young left-wing artist, a friend of mine in Ukraine. So what can history give us? Why could history be helpful? The first is that the first reason is that it broadens the imagination. And this is a point I'm sure that you all understand. If we just look at the United States in terms of our fears today, or what people are talking about today, we're trapped in the kind of horizon of the moment. It's very easy to be disoriented, and it's very hard to think, where could this be going? History broadens the imagination. It's not that history repeats or that history even rhymes, although the idea that history rhymes is something Mark Twain said, and like many things that Mark Twain said, it's very charming, but it's not quite true. History doesn't repeat, it doesn't even rhyme, but it does broaden the imagination, because everything that happened could happen, right? Everything that happened has that to be said for it, that it could happen. History helps us to recognize patterns. So I'm not saying that it's the only way to see things, but it does help you notice things that you might not otherwise notice. So for example, in the firing of Mr. Comey, which I think is like clearly deserving itself of some kind of 3-act Greek drama, right? I'm waiting for someone to write that, someone who can rhyme, you know, in ancient Greek, someone who likes to have choruses and so on. But with Comey, one thing which is really telling about the Comey firing is the loyalty. The loyalty. Okay, so like if you have like family members in the mafia, I don't have to dwell on this for you, but there's another context. I didn't realize that'd be such a hit in Guilford. Okay, all right, that was a Providence, Rhode Island joke. Right? All right, which I should have said. Hey, I lived there for 5 years. All right, I have some good Providence, Rhode Island mob stories, which I'm not going to tell now, but they're good. All right. So patterns, the loyalty. Now, in all seriousness, the loyalty is a rival form of political organization to law. If you demand loyalty, what you're saying is you have to break the law in order to be with me. When Mr. Trump says to Mr. Comey, "We have that thing," that's what he's talking about. He's saying, I believe that you and I, Mr. Comey, have entered into this personal relationship which transcends your legal and my legal responsibilities and duties. In the history that I work in, loyalty immediately summons to mind the loyalty oath of 1934 in Nazi Germany, because it is that loyalty oath which transformed Hitler from chancellor to Führer, to leader. It's that personal loyalty which brings you out of the previous legal system and into something entirely new, right? So you notice things like that. The third thing that history can help with is the guidance. And so this book it's not really my wisdom, right? It's my attempt, because I don't have that much, it's my attempt to channel people who I think very wisely understood darker moments than we have yet faced, and had the generosity to leave behind for us useful words of instruction. And I mean that word generosity very seriously. If we think of Victor Klemperer, the German Jewish literary critic who wrote a diary in Nazi Germany, he was not writing for himself. He was not writing for his peers or even his generation. I mean, what he wrote was in the drawer until literally in the drawer, or in hiding until much later. He's writing for us. He's so clear and so beautifully elegant and so instructive for us. Václav Havel, the very important Czech anti-communist dissident writing in the 1970s, whose pamphlet Power of the Powerless I cite in the book. Nobody read that in 1977. Even the Czechs didn't read it in 1977. It was published illegally. It was underground. There wasn't much chance it could have. Why was he writing it? I think because humanly he wanted to understand his own position in what he called a post-totalitarian world. But he was also writing it for us. The clarity of the exposition and the universality of the prescription that what you do in everyday life is actually politically significant all the time. That honesty is actually politically significant. The universality of those prescriptions suggests he is also writing for us. He's writing for people in the future who are going to face difficult moments. So history means that you can escape the flat, the horizon. You can get out of the limits of our own moment, and you can think about yourself as being between past and future, which is, I think, really important. We get shocked, we get surprised, we get disoriented, we get depressed. If we can learn from the past through these people or through other people, it's like we're casting a line back, which they catch, or they're throwing the line forward to us, which we catch. And no longer are we stuck in the flat horizon of the present. Suddenly, instead, we can see how there's a line, a moral line, an ethical line, a political line, which stretches back from them through us to the things that we do every day, and then into a future, which might just be a little bit better than the present that we have now. So those are the things history can do. And it means that you recognize, I can talk more about that. It means that you know where to seek guidance. I can talk more about that. But let me just close with a couple of very brief words about the lessons themselves. So I've been giving you some of the background of the book, where it comes from, why I care about the founders, who my own guides in this book are. The book itself has 20 lessons, and it's very short. It's meant to be very short. It's meant to be easy to carry around, to process. It's meant to be easy to read over and over again. And there's a reason why I didn't devote my lecture to talking about it, because if I did, right, I could actually read the whole thing. Or alternatively, which has happened, someone could read the book silently to herself while I was giving the talk, which is my second thank you to you for not doing that, right? So I'm just going to give you a sense of a couple of the lessons from the book, because what the book is really meant to do is to condense all of these things that I think I've understood from other people's experiences into a very practical and simple handbook of things that even if we can't do all of them, all of us can do some of them, and they all will make a difference. So the first lesson in the book is don't obey in advance. And this is one that I think you've probably already understood, but I want to share with you why I think this one is so profound and why it stands in front of all the others. Don't obey in advance is one of the few things that the historians of Nazi Germany agree about. So I did other kinds of history with nicer people before I started doing the history of Nazi Germany. Like, you would think that people who do the history of the Holocaust would be like a nice, sympathetic. Okay, I'm on tape now saying that they're really not. They disagree brutally about all kinds of things, and they're too polemical, and they don't have good table manners, and But in general, there is one. They actually have excellent table manners. I want to throw that. There is one thing that we tend to agree about, and that is the don't obey in advance. That in 1933, the regime change that Hitler effected required consent from below. Required for consent from below. When we think about Hitler or Stalin or totalitarians from history in general, we tend to imagine them as supervillains who stride in from outside history and then who stand immediately on a pedestal, right, on a balcony in an opera house, and immediately command the support of millions. But that's not how it actually happens. How it happens is you have a series of events, an election maybe, like in Germany in November 1932, an accident, a terrorist attack maybe, like in March of 1933, and people give their consent. They give their consent in unusual ways, by not resisting, by saying this is normal, by putting things off for tomorrow, by not making eye contact with their neighbors, by walking across the street instead of greeting people. Little things like this amount to consent. This is the thing that we have understood. My brilliant German colleagues have written about this beautifully. like Petr Longovic in his book called Holocaust. The little things that people do or don't do and how that amounts to a necessary condition for a regime change. Now, this is important because this is one of the things that we think we've understood. It's also important psychologically. Psychologically, if you can stop at the beginning and say, what do I care about? This is not normal. It's not, by the way. This is not normal. I mean, your community center is great. It's more than normal. I'm gesturing at the larger world, right? This is not normal. If you can say this is not normal, and then if you can ask yourself, what do I think is normal, right? What do I think is good? And stick to that, even though it feels awkward and strange, because most people will drift. Most people will drift. If you can do that, then you can do a whole lot of other things. But if you don't do that, psychologically you're done for. There's a reason why. I'll give you another example. After 1968, when the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact invaded Czechoslovakia during a moment when the Czechoslovak communist leadership were trying to reform, the period after that was called normalization. And for a reason, right? Normalization doesn't mean that things are normal. Normalization means human beings bend their souls to the new thing. That is what we tend to do. And if you do that, if you say it's normal to have Soviet tanks on the streets, or it's normal to have a president who doesn't care at all for the rule of law, right? If you move towards that, it's normal that whole big swaths of our media are no longer about the facts. If you just shrug your shoulders, you can't get that psychological capacity back. Once you normalize inside, it's basically impossible to undo that. So psychologically, it's very important. And then politically, it's very important because of timing. Again, one of the things that historians pretty much understand and agree about, and also political scientists agree about, and if historians and political scientists agree about something, it's probably true, because there's so little overlap in general, and that is the timing. In the first weeks and months, the power of the individual citizen is actually increased. You're actually more powerful than you are in a normal democratic situation, because your actions or inactions can stop or start an authoritarian regime change. In the first few weeks and months, that is, maybe out to a year, that's true. But if you waste that moment, if you say mañana, right? If you say, I'm going to wait till it's worse, or I'm going to wait till my friends are doing it, or I'm going to wait till this or that or the other thing. If you wait too long, if you wait the 6 months, the 9 months, the political system might have already changed to the point where action has real costs. We're in that moment now where the risks we take are very, very small, right? At least if you're a citizen. I understand people's positions can be different if you're not. But if you're a citizen, the risks we're taking now are really rather small compared to the risks that other people have taken in other parts of American history, or that other people take around the world all the time. If you wait, that will change. And you will be making it change by waiting, right? We are in a moment where there are no options that aren't choices. You can't opt out. There's no out to opt into. You're in regardless of what you do. So that's number one. Don't obey in advance. If you could do that, then you can do any others. If you can't do that, then all the others immediately become impossible. Number two, support institutions, which you are doing, thank you. Support institutions means the constitutional institutions. The framers did not think the constitutional institutions were robotic machines that would act on their own. When people say the institutions will rescue us, that is undermining the institutions that are supposed to rescue us. The framers did not think that the judiciary or the legislature were going to act in a vacuum and protect the citizenry. They thought the government was us. If we say the institutions will protect us, we are making the distinction between them and us. And that distinction between them and us will be fatal for both them and us, right? So you have to protect the constitutional institutions, do what you can for them, even if you don't like the people who are currently in office. Will then run for office, support the opposition, do something to support that institution. Institutions also mean professional institutions. Whether you're a musician or a veterinarian or a lawyer or a civil servant, there has to be an ethic around those vocations which allows people to say no. or at least to question, or at least to pause, or to consult one another about what's right and wrong. And there are, of course, lawyers and physicians and actually civil servants all over the country forming those horizontal connections, talking to one another at moments of strife, deciding what they should be doing. That we need that. And we need the non-governmental organizations. The American idea of freedom, the Hollywood idea of freedom, has the lone individual, right, facing down the whole government, you know, with a lightsaber or whatever. That does not happen, right? That cannot happen. When you get to the point where it's the whole government and the one person with the lightsaber, or, you know, if with like Wonder Woman with the thing, the bracelets, whatever it is, when you get to that moment, you have lost, right? It's already over. The way to not get to that moment is to have civil society, to do things like this, to have the non-governmental organizations, because it's not just about freedom of association. Freedom is association. If you're alone, it's very hard to be free. It's a romantic myth, you know, Prometheus chained on the rock, whatever, you know, poets dying of tuberculosis on the Crimea. It's very romantic, but that's not the way that you win. You win freedom by association, by having associations which fill up the space or create the space between those lonely individuals and the government. And even if those institutions are not directly political, they matter hugely. They slow things down. Number 10 is truth. Number 10 is truth, believe in truth. That's awkward, right? In the 21st century, to say, I believe in truth, it's a little awkward. A lot of things are awkward. Freedom is awkward. Freedom's always awkward. It always feels awkward to be a free person. To be an authoritarian person is very comfortable. You're just kind of putting your antenna out and doing what everybody else does. You're listening for the story that you want to hear. And there's somebody who's going to tell it to you, and he's the President of the United States. There are people who are going to tell you stories, and you like those stories. That's being an authoritarian. And lots of people are like that. I'm not looking at any of you in particular, but lots of people are like that. If you want to be a free person, it's awkward. And one of the awkward things is caring about the truth and saying, I believe that there is truth. I believe that there are facts. I believe that there are people who actually pursue the facts and they ought to be supported. I believe that it's not all gray. I believe that some things are truer than others. I believe that some people are actually honestly trying to figure out what's going on, and that those people are morally superior to others who are just propagating nonsense over and over again. Or, more modestly, I believe that human beings who write are better than robots who propagate. There's a modest statement, right? I believe that human beings who take their bodies and try to figure things out, who move their bodies and write on the basis of conversations with other human beings, are better than internet robots who propagate things, right? We should all agree to that, I think. I think we can all agree to those modest formulations of there is truth. Negatively, this is very important, because every kind of authoritarian or totalitarian regime change depends upon destroying your sense that there is a fact. The fascists say, don't worry about your everyday experience. What matters is the myth of the people, of the unity, of the mystical connection between the people and the leader. The communists said, what matters is not your everyday experience or the truth. What matters is a vision of the future. And we are perfectly willing to sacrifice what's happening to you now for that vision of the future. 21st century postmodern authoritarianism says, well, it doesn't say anything. That's the difference. There's no vision. What it says is, what it does is it lies. It fills up the public sphere with lies. And then it says, it's not me who lies, it's the journalists. And then it says, who knows anyway? Who knows anyway, right? And if that, and, you know, that is Vladimir Putin, and that is Donald Trump, and that is also a universal political style of the 21st century. And if you shrug your shoulders and say, well, that doesn't matter, that sounds nice, that sounds like a graduate seminar I once had at Berkeley or whatever. If you say that sounds normal, right, then you're taking part. You're taking part in an authoritarian regime change. Number 19 is be a patriot. And I'm gonna, this is awkward, I only have two hands. I'm gonna read a bit from number 19, be a patriot, and then I'll be done, and then we can talk. So number 19 is about the difference between nationalism and you're trying to you have more hands than I do. It's okay. I'm gonna manage this. Thank you though. It's about the difference between nationalism and patriotism, where nationalism is about telling people what they want to hear, and patriotism is about caring about your country by applying universal standards to it. Let me just read the last bits of this little chapter. A nationalist encourages us to be our worst and then tells us that we are the best. A nationalist, quote, although endlessly brooding on power, victory, defeat, revenge, wrote George Orwell, tends to be, quote, uninterested in what happens in the real world. Nationalism is relativist, since the only truth is the resentment we feel when we contemplate others. As the novelist Danilo Kish put it, nationalism, quote, has no universal values, aesthetic or ethical. A patriot, by contrast, wants the nation to live up to its ideals, which means asking us to be our best selves. A patriot must be concerned with the real world, which is the only place where his country can be loved and sustained. A patriot has universal values, standards by which he judges his nation, always wishing it well, and wishing that it would do better. Democracy failed in Europe in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, and it is failing not only in much of Europe, but in many parts of the world today. It is that history and experience that reveals to us the dark range of our possible futures. A nationalist will say, it can't happen here, which is the first step towards disaster. A patriot will say that it could happen here, but that we will stop it. Thank you.